Do not touch me, Marisol. If you touch me, I won't be able to let you go. I didn't listen. That was my recklessness. That was the choice that set fire to the safe, quiet life I'd spent 3 years building. I reached out and pressed my hand against the fever burning through his soaked shirt. He didn't pull away. He didn't strike me. The most powerful alpha in the territory, the man who banished me for being weak, shuddered, his knees hitting the pavement as he leaned into my palm like a starving animal. "Please," he whimpered, the rain masking the tears on his face. "Just one breath. Let me take one breath of you before I die." And breathe. Welcome back to Storm's Werewolf Romance Library. We are diving deep into the storm tonight, right into the heart of obsession and redemption. If you felt that tension in your chest, do me a favor, hit that like button and subscribe. It tells YouTube that our pack is strong and hungry for more. For those of you who want to support these stories directly and get early access, check out our channel membership options. I want to hear from you. Where are you listening from right now? Are you winding down in Lagos, commuting in New York, or maybe relaxing in Manila? Drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far our territory reaches. Now, let's open the door. Let's see if she saves him, or if she lets him burn. Chapter 1. The Life I Built in the Ashes. The rain in the city always sounded different than it did in the mountains. In Valle Santo, rain was a symphony of thunder, echoing off granite peaks, and the hiss of water striking ancient redwoods, a sound so loud it vibrated in your teeth. Here, in amidst the concrete and steel, it was just a relentless, rhythmic drumming against the plate glass window of my bakery. It was a lonely sound, but it was mine. I wiped down the butcher block counter of the Gilded Crumb for the third time that night, the coarse wood smooth under my palm. The scent of yeast, caramelized sugar, and vanilla bean hung heavy in the air, a perfume of comfort that I had wrapped around myself like a shield for 3 years. This was the life I had built from the wreckage of the girl who had been exiled. The girl who was told she was too soft, too fragile, too full of dreams to survive the harsh winter of a wolf pack. I paused, my hand stilling on the wood, as a phantom ache throbbed in the center of my chest. It had been happening more frequently lately, a dull, a hollow pull that felt like a fishhook snagged on my heart, tugging me toward the north, toward him. I ignored it, just as I had ignored every instinct to run back to the man who had shattered me. 3 years ago, Alpha Leandro had looked me in the eye in front of the entire pack and told me that I was a liability. He had said the Valle Santo needed a Luna with iron in her veins, not a healer who cried over wounded sparrows. He hadn't just rejected me, he had banished me, ensuring I couldn't even stay on the periphery of the territory to be tormented by his presence. He had been cruel, efficient, and devastatingly thorough. And tonight, the anniversary of that rejection, the bond was screaming. I moved to the display case, pulling the last tray of unsold cinnamon twists. I would donate them to the shelter down the street, just like I did every Tuesday. It was a routine. I loved routines. They were safe. They didn't have amber eyes or voices that commanded the tides. I turned off the main lights, plunging the bakery into a soft golden twilight, illuminated only by the street lamps outside. I was proud of this place. I was proud that I paid my own rent, that I didn't need a pack to survive, and that I had learned to be strong in ways Leandro would never understand. Softness wasn't a weakness, it was a different kind of endurance. Water wore down stone eventually, didn't it? A sudden, thunderous impact shook the front door, rattling the glass in its frame. I jumped, nearly dropping the tray of pastries. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs, and my wolf, usually dormant and quiet in the city, bristled beneath my skin, letting out a low and warning whine. It wasn't a polite knock. It was a desperate, heavy collision, as if a body had been thrown against the entrance. I froze, staring at the locked door. The closed sign was clearly visible. I waited, breath held, expecting a drunk from the bar down the block, or maybe a lost tourist seeking shelter from the downpour. But the pounding came again, weaker this time, followed by a sound that made my blood turn to ice. It was a low, guttural whimper, a sound of pure animal distress. I shouldn't have moved. I should have called the police or gone out the back exit. But the pull in my chest, that nagging fishhook, suddenly yanked hard enough to steal my breath. I walked toward the door, my movements automatic, drawn by a force older than gravity, and I unlocked the deadbolt with trembling fingers and pushed the door open against the wind. The storm lashed at my face, cold and biting, but I didn't feel it. I only felt the heat radiating from the massive dark shape collapsed on my welcome mat. A man was on his knees, his head bowed, his body shaking so violently that I could hear his teeth chattering over the sound of the rain. He was soaked, his clothes clinging to a frame that looked too thin, too jagged. Slowly, agonizingly, he lifted his head. Chapter 2. The Ghost of Valle Santo. The man on my doorstep was a ruin. He looked like a king whose kingdom had burned to ash around him, leaving him scorched and starving in the debris. It took my brain a full, terrifying second to reconcile the image of this broken creature with the memory of the imperious, terrifying alpha who had once towered over me. Leandro. It was him, but it wasn't him. The Leandro I remembered was pure, unadulterated power. A man who moved with the silent lethality of a predator and spoke with the absolute authority of a god. This man was gray-faced and gaunt, his cheekbones threatening to slice through his skin, dark circles carved like bruises beneath eyes that were glassy with fever. He was dying. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. Wolves didn't get sick. Alphas didn't get sick. Unless they had severed a soul bond. Marisol, he rasps, the name tearing out of his throat like it was made of broken glass. He didn't command. He didn't demand entry. He just said my name as if it were the only word left in his vocabulary. Then a plea for salvation, or perhaps just an acknowledgement of his own damnation. He tried to stand, his hands scrabbling against the doorframe, but his legs gave out, and he slumped back down onto the wet concrete. The rain plastered his dark hair to his skull, water dripping from his nose and chin, mixing with the sweat of a raging fever. My instinct to slam the door and protect myself warred with the overwhelming biological imperative to help him. He had banished me, he had thrown me away. But looking at him now, shivering uncontrollably, I didn't see a monster. I saw a tragedy. Leandro, I whispered, the name tasting like ash and honey on my tongue. What are you doing here? You exiled me. You can't be here. My voice was shaking, lacking the steel I thought I had cultivated over the last 3 years. He looked up at me, and the raw, naked hunger in his eyes nearly brought me to my knees. It wasn't sexual, though the heat of it scorched me. It was existential. He looked at me like a man who had been holding his breath for 3 years and had finally found oxygen. I tried, he choked out, his chest heaving with the effort of speaking. I tried to stay away, but the silence in the valley is too loud. He reached a hand toward me, his fingers trembling, stained with mud and oil. But he stopped inches from my shoes. He didn't touch me. He didn't dare. It was that restraint, that terrifying hesitation from a man who used to take whatever he wanted, that broke my resolve. He was terrified of me. The alpha of Valle Santo was terrified that I would turn him away. You're sick, I said, my healer's eye noting the tremors, the unnatural heat radiating off him in waves that combated the chill of the storm. This is the severing. You never took another mate. It wasn't a question. If he had chosen another, the bond would have snapped cleanly, leaving a scar but allowing him to live. This slow deterioration, this rotting from the inside out, only happened when a wolf rejected their fated mate but refused to replace them. He had chosen solitude over me, and it was killing him. "There is no other," he whispered, his eyes rolling back slightly before he forced them open again, fighting to keep me in focus. "There never was, just you. Only ever you." He slumped forward, his forehead resting against the toe of my sneaker, a gesture of absolute submission that made my world tilt on its axis. "I don't need you to forgive me, Marisol. I don't deserve it. But please, don't make me die in the rain." Chapter 3. The Enemy in My Living Room. I didn't think, I just reacted. I grabbed him by the shoulders of his soaked jacket and hauled him upward. He was dead weight, heavy with muscle and bone, but he tried to help me, pushing himself up with a groan of agony until we stumbled into the warmth of the bakery. I kicked the door shut behind us, locking out the storm, but the chaos had already invaded. The smell of him filled the small space instantly. Rain, ozone, and the deep, rich scent of cedarwood and wet earth. It was the scent of the forest I had lost, the scent of the home I wasn't allowed to return to, and it made my wolf howl with a mixture of grief and joy. I half-dragged, half-carried him through the kitchen and up the narrow stairs to my apartment above the shop. His arm draped over my shoulders, his heat searing through my clothes like a brand. By the time we reached my living room, he was barely conscious. I steered him toward the beige sofa, pushing him down before his legs could fail again. He collapsed onto the cushions, looking massive and incongruous in my delicate feminine space. My apartment was full of plants, soft throws, and books, a sanctuary of peace. Now a dying predator was shivering on my upholstery, bringing the mud and the danger of the wild into my safe haven. I rushed to the bathroom, grabbing towels and a basin of cool water, my mind racing. I needed to get his temperature down. I needed to get the wet clothes off him. I needed to stop shaking. When I returned, he was trying to unbutton his shirt, his fingers clumsy and useless against the wet fabric. "Let me," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. I batted his hands away and began undoing the buttons myself. The moment my knuckles brushed the skin of his chest, a jolt of static electricity so violent it was audible snapped between us. We both gasped, the air in the room suddenly thick and heavy, charged with a tension that made the hair on my arms stand up. His eyes flew open, the pupils blown wide, swallowing the amber iris. "Marisol," he breathed, his hand coming up to cover mine, pressing my palm flat against his thundering heart. His skin was burning, scalding hot, but the shivers racking his frame were violent. "Careful. If you touch me too much, I won't be able to leave. My wolf. He knows you're here. He thinks we're home." "You aren't going anywhere in this condition," I said, trying to pull my hand away, but he held it there. Not with force, but with a desperate, clinging weakness. I could feel the erratic, galloping rhythm of his heart, a drumbeat that synced perfectly with my own. I peeled the wet shirt off his shoulders, exposing a chest defined by hard muscle, but marred by the protrusion of his ribs. He was starving. The most powerful wolf in the territory was starving to death because his soul refused to eat without me. "I didn't come to stay," he murmured, his eyes tracking my face as I wrung out a cool cloth. He leaned into my touch when I wiped the mud from his fever-flushed cheek. A low rumble building in his chest, a purr of pure relief. "I came to look at you, just to look. I thought, if I could see you one last time, the fading wouldn't hurt so much." He caught my wrist, stopping my ministrations, his gaze piercing through my defenses. I lied to you, Marisol. 3 years ago. I said you were weak, but I was the one who was too afraid to keep you." Chapter 4. A Cage of Gold and Silence. The silence that followed his confession was heavier than the storm battering the windows. Leandro sat on the edge of my beige sofa, a towel draped over his shoulders, staring at the floorboards as if they contained the secrets of the universe. I had offered him the couch, piled high with my softest knitted throws, and pillows that smelled of lavender. But he had refused. He had looked at the velvet cushions with a strange mixture of longing and revulsion, shaking his head slowly. He told me he wasn't a guest. He was a penance. He insisted on the rug, a thick, woven thing I'd bought at a flea market, claiming that a creature who had lost his way didn't deserve the comfort of a hearth he had destroyed. No matter how much I argued, pointing out that he was shaking with fever and barely upright, he wouldn't budge. It was the first flash of the old alpha I had seen, that stubborn iron-jawed resolve, even if it was currently directed at his own suffering. I retreated to my bedroom, leaving the door cracked open a few inches, unable to completely sever the connection between us. My apartment, usually a sanctuary of golden light and quiet jazz, felt charged, the air humming with the static of an apex predator sleeping in the living room. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the ragged rhythm of his breathing in the next room. It was a terrifying sound, wet, uneven, and punctuated by small sharp hitches that sounded painfully like suppressed sobs. Every instinct I had as a healer screamed at me to go back out there, to curl around him and let my body heat leach the sickness from his bones. But my heart, the treacherous organ he had broken 3 years ago, kept me pinned to the mattress. If I went to him now, if I crossed that threshold and offered him the comfort he was starving for, I knew I would never be able to send him away again. Hours bled into the night, the rain softening to a steady drizzle against the glass. I must have dozed off, pulled under by exhaustion, because the sound that woke me wasn't the storm. It was a scream. It didn't sound human. It was a raw, guttural tear in the fabric of the night, a sound of absolute primal terror. I was out of bed before I was fully awake, but my bare feet slapping against the hardwood as I sprinted into the living room. Leandro was thrashing on the rug, tangling himself in the blankets I had forced on him, his claws extended and gouging deep grooves into the floor. He was fighting an invisible enemy, his face contorted in agony, sweat slicking his skin despite the chill of the room. "No," he moaned, the word dragging out into a howl. "Don't leave, please, not her. Take the pack, take the blood, but don't take her." He was dreaming of the banishment. He was dreaming of the moment he cut me out of his life. I dropped to my knees beside him, terrified to touch him, but unable to watch him tear himself apart. His eyes were squeezed shut, tears leaking from the corners, mixing with the sweat on his temples. "Healer," he gasped, his voice cracking. "And I need the healer." Chapter 5. Breakfast with a Monster. Morning sunlight hit the living room with the subtlety of a sledgehammer, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air and the wreckage of the night before. Leandro was sitting up against the base of the sofa, looking like a man who had gone 12 rounds with a bear and lost. His skin was still pale, possessing a translucent quality that terrified me, but the fever heat had receded to a simmer rather than a boil. He was watching me as I moved around the kitchen, his amber eyes tracking my every movement with unnerving precision. He looked out of place in the morning light, too dark, too large, a shadow that had forgotten how to fade when the sun came up. I was making coffee, the rich aroma filling the small space, trying to pretend that my excommunicated alpha wasn't sitting on my rug, wearing nothing but a pair of borrowed sweatpants that were tight enough to be a sin. "I can help," he rasped, his voice sounding like gravel tumbling down a mountainside. He tried to stand, bracing himself against the sofa, his legs trembling with the effort. It was painful to watch. The Leandro of my memories moved with liquid grace, a creature of perfect kinetic efficiency. This Leandro moved like a rusted machine. He stumbled toward the counter, reaching for the carafe of coffee I had just brewed. "I can pour. I am not invalid, Marisol. I can be useful." "Leandro, sit down," I said softly, reaching out to stop him, but I was too late. His hand, usually steady enough to stitch a wound in the field, jerked violently as he lifted the glass pot. The carafe slipped from his grip, shattering against the ceramic tile of the kitchen floor. Hot coffee splashed everywhere, soaking the hem of his pants and pooling around his bare feet. The crash was deafening in the small apartment. Leandro froze, his entire body going rigid. He looked down at the broken glass, then up at me, his eyes wide with a flash of genuine fear. He expected me to yell. He expected the anger he felt he deserved. He flinched, actually flinched, as I stepped toward him. "Don't," he whispered, backing up until he hit the refrigerator. "I'll clean it. I'm sorry. I'm clumsy. The sickness. It takes the dexterity first." He looked so devastated over a spilled pot of coffee that my heart shattered right alongside the glass. I didn't yell. I didn't scold. I stepped over the mess and took his hand. The one that was still shaking, and inspected it. A shard of glass had nicked his thumb, a bead of dark red blood welling up. "It's just coffee, Leandro," I said, my voice thick with emotion. I ran my thumb over the cut, calling on the smallest fraction of my healing gift. A spark, bright and hot, jumped between our skin. It wasn't just magic. It was the bond, recognizing its other half. The cut sealed instantly, leaving smooth skin behind. Leandro gasped, the air rushing into his lungs as if I had just jump-started his heart. He didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned down, bringing his face inches from my neck, inhaling deeply, desperately, his nose brushing the sensitive skin below my ear. "You smell like the city," he murmured, his voice vibrating against my collarbone, dark and possessive. "You smell like strangers, like them. It makes me want to tear this building down brick by brick until the only thing you smell like is rain and me." Chapter 6. The Guardian at the Counter. The walk to the Gilded Crumb was a lesson in tension. Leandro insisted on coming with me, claiming that he needed to secure the perimeter, a military phrase that sounded ridiculous when applied to a bakery that specialized in sourdough and petit fours. But I let him come, partially because I didn't trust him not to try and fix my toaster and burn the apartment down in his current state, and partially because the thought of leaving him alone made my chest ache. He walked a step behind me the entire way, a silent, looming shadow. He was wearing the clothes I had dried overnight, his ruined suit pants and a plain black t-shirt I had bought for an ex-boyfriend who never wore it. On Leandro, the shirt strained across the shoulders, emphasizing the sheer scale of him compared to the humans rushing past us on the sidewalk. Inside the bakery, the morning rush was a controlled chaos of steam, shouting, and the chime of the door. I tied my apron on and went to work, slipping into the rhythm that had saved my sanity 3 years ago. I kneaded, I poured, I smiled. I made change. I was efficient. I was good at this, and for the first time, I was hyper-aware of being watched. Leandro had taken a seat at the small table in the far corner, his back to the wall, a position that gave him a clear view of the entire room and the front door. He didn't look at his phone. He didn't look at the coffee I had placed in front of him. He looked at me. His gaze was a physical weight, heavy and hot. He watched my hands as I dusted flour over a loaf. He watched my hips as I navigated around the display cases. It wasn't the leering look of the men who sometimes came in here. It was a look of profound, bewildered awe. He was seeing the woman he had banished, the weak girl, running a kingdom of her own. Every time our eyes met across the room, the air between us crackled, scorching and electric. I flustered, dropping a pair of tongs, my cheeks heating up. He didn't smile, but his eyes darkened, his pupils blowing wide as he tracked the flush spreading down my neck. He was drinking in my competence like it was wine, realizing too late that strength didn't always look like claws and teeth. "Hey, sweetheart, I ordered a latte 10 minutes ago." The voice was loud, grating, and dripping with entitlement. A man in a sharp suit was leaning over the counter, invading my personal space. His face flushed with impatience. He wasn't just rude, he was aggressive, his hand slapping the wood surface inches from my fingers. "Are you deaf?" I said I'm waiting. "I'm sorry, sir, we're backed up," I said, keeping my voice polite, though my wolf bristled. "It's coming right up." "Yeah, well, hurry it up," the man sneered, reaching out as if to tap my arm or grab my attention physically. "I don't have all day to watch you prance around." The air in the shop suddenly dropped 10 degrees. The chatter of the other customers died instantly, silenced by a sound so low it was felt in the marrow of the bone rather than heard. It was a growl, a subsonic, vibrating threat that rattled the espresso cups in their saucers. I froze. The man froze, his hand hovering in midair. In the corner, Leandro was standing up. He didn't rush. He didn't shout. He simply unfolded his massive frame from the chair, the movement fluid and predatory, his eyes glowing a distinct, terrifying amber. The glass of the water pitcher on his table shattered, unable to withstand the sudden spike in his aura. "She told you to wait," Leandro said. His voice was soft, barely a whisper, but it carried across the room like a gunshot. "If you reach for her again, you will be pulling back a stump." Chapter 7. Restraint. The walk back to the apartment was silent, but it was a loud silence, the kind that vibrated in your teeth and made the air feel thin. I unlocked the door with hands that weren't quite steady, and the moment the lock clicked, the tension in the hallway snapped. I turned on him before he could even step fully onto the mat, my chest heaving with a mixture of adrenaline and fury. He had terrified a customer. He had shattered a glass pitcher without even touching it. He had brought the violence of Valle Santo into my sanctuary, into the one place I had sworn would remain peaceful. But looking at him, towering in my entryway, with his shoulders hunched and his eyes burning with that terrifying golden need, my anger felt dangerously like arousal. "You can't do that," I hissed, throwing my keys into the bowl on the console table with more force than necessary. "You can't just growl at people, Leandro. This isn't the territory. You don't own the city. You don't own me." I waited for him to argue, to assert his alpha dominance, to tell me that the man had disrespected me and deserved to be torn apart. That was what the old Leandro would have done. But this Leandro, this broken, starving creature, he just closed the door softly behind him and leaned his forehead against the wood, closing his eyes as if the effort of standing was costing him everything. "I know," he rumbled, the sound vibrating through the floorboards and up into the soles of my feet. He turned slowly, his movements fluid but heavy, like a predator moving through deep water. "I know I don't own you, Marisol. I surrendered that right the night I sent you away. But seeing him look at you, seeing him speak to you as if you were servant," his jaw clenched, the muscle feathering beneath the stubble on his cheek. It took every ounce of restraint I have left not to paint the walls with him. "I handled it," I insisted, though my voice lacked the conviction I wanted. "I have been handling it for 3 years. I don't need a monster to stand guard for me." He laughed then. It was a dry, humorless sound that scraped against my nerves. He took a step toward me, invading my personal space, forcing me to tilt my head back to meet his gaze. "You think I don't know that? You think I haven't watched you handle it?" The confession hung in the air between us, heavy and damning. My breath hitched. He had banished me. He had severed contact. He was supposed to have forgotten me. "You watched me?" I whispered, the betrayal warring with a thrill I hated myself for feeling. "Every day," he confessed, stepping closer until his chest brushed the front of my shirt, his heat searing through the fabric. "I told myself I was checking to make sure you were safe, but I was lying. I was starving, Marisol. I looked at photos of your bakery online. I read the reviews just to see people praise your hands. And I tortured myself with the life you built without me, because it was the only way I could feel anything other than the cold." He brought his hands up, hovering them on either side of my face, but not touching, respecting the boundary I had drawn, even as he obliterated it with his presence. Be angry at me, hate me, punish me, Marisol, but do not ask me to ignore that you are mine. My wolf would sooner rip my own heart out than let another man disrespect you. Chapter 8. The fever breaks. The adrenaline that had sustained him at the bakery evaporated the moment the sun went down. It was terrifying to watch. 1 minute he was pacing my living room, radiating that dark, possessive energy, and the next he was collapsing onto the rug, his legs simply refusing to hold him. The severing wasn't just a mood, it was a biological failure. His body was shutting down, cell by cell, because it believed it had lost its other half. I knelt beside him, panic rising in my throat, as I felt the heat radiating off his skin. He was burning up. The fever was sudden and violent, an inferno that turned his skin slick with sweat and made his breath come in ragged, shallow gasps. "Leandro," I said, my voice trembling as I pressed my cool palm to his forehead. He leaned into the touch so hard I thought he might snap his own neck. A low whine building in his throat. "We need to get this fever down. You're cooking from the inside out." I didn't ask for permission this time. I went into healer mode, the part of me that was clinical and efficient, taking over the part of me that was a heartbroken woman. I dragged the heavy knit blanket off him and began to strip him of his clothes. His t-shirt was soaked through, clinging to his skin like a second layer. I peeled it off, revealing a torso that was a map of tragedy. He was thinner than I had ever seen him, his ribs visible beneath the taut skin, but it was the scars that stopped me. Silver lines crisscrossed his chest and arms, marks of reckless hunts, of fights he hadn't bothered to defend himself against. He hadn't just been lonely, he had been trying to get himself killed. I ran a cool, damp cloth over his chest, tracing the line of his sternum. He shuddered, his eyes fluttering open, unfocused and glassy. The smell of him, usually rain and cedar, was sour with sickness, but beneath it, the deep musky scent of my mate still called to me, tugging at my very core. I worked silently, cooling his skin, murmuring soft nonsense words meant to soothe a wounded animal. But I was angry at him, furious at the waste of it all, but my hands were gentle. They couldn't be anything else. "Marisol," he groaned, his head thrashing against the pillow I had shoved under him. He reached out blindly, his hand clamping around my wrist with a grip that was bruising in its desperation. He pulled my hand down, pressing it flat against the center of his chest, directly over his heart. The rhythm beneath my palm was erratic, skipping beats, fluttering like a bird trapped in a cage. But the moment my skin touched his, the rhythm changed. It steadied. Thump, 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 stronger, slower. "Do you feel that?" he whispered, his eyes finding mine, lucid for a terrifying second. "It only beats when you touch me. If you take your hand away, it stops. It just stops." Tears leaked from the corners of his eyes, untracking through the sweat on his temples. "I am a dead man breathing your air, Marisol. Don't stop touching me, please." Chapter 9. The Confession. The fever broke in the darkest hour of the night, leaving the apartment silent and heavy with the scent of exhaustion. The storm outside had passed, leaving only the damp hiss of tires on wet pavement below. I sat on the floor, my back against the sofa, Leandro's head resting heavily in my lap. I had been stroking his hair for hours, unable to stop, unable to sever the contact that was keeping him anchored to the living world. His breathing had evened out, the terrifying heat dissipating into a clammy cool. When he finally spoke, his voice was a wreck, a rasp of sandpaper and regret, but it was clear. "I didn't send you away because you were weak," he said into the silence. And he didn't open his eyes. He just lay there, vulnerable in a way no alpha should ever be. "I sent you away because Valle Santo is a meat grinder. The politics, the challenges, The constant threat of the border wars, it turns everyone into stone. I looked at you, Marisol, with your garden and your healing hands, and I knew that if I made you Luna, the pack would hollow you out. He took a ragged breath, turning his face slightly to press a kiss to the fabric of my jeans. I thought I was being noble. I thought I was saving the only beautiful thing in my life from being destroyed by the ugliness of mine. I stared down at him, my heart twisting in my chest. For 3 years I had carried the weight of his rejection like a stone, believing I wasn't enough, believing I was defective. And all this time he hadn't been judging me, and he had been protecting me. But it wasn't a relief. It was a tragedy. "You coward," I whispered, the words trembling with a sudden, fierce anger. Leandro's eyes flew open, fixing on my face. He looked shocked, expecting pity, perhaps, or forgiveness. He didn't expect the fire. "You didn't ask me," I said, my voice rising. "You made a decision for me. You decided I couldn't handle it. You decided my softness was a liability, but you didn't give me the chance to prove you wrong. You treated me like a child, Leandro. You broke my heart to save your own conscience." I pulled my hand away from his hair, and he flinched as if I had struck him. "That wasn't nobility, that was fear. You were terrified that you loved me too much to lead effectively, so you cut me out." He struggled to sit up, his movements weak but determined, until he was facing me, our knees touching on the rug. The truth of my words hit him. I could see it in the way his shoulders slumped, the way the arrogance drained out of him. "Yes," he admitted, the word a ghost. I was terrified. "I looked at you and saw the only thing that could destroy me. So I tried to remove the weakness." He reached for my hand again, his fingers hovering, waiting for permission I wasn't sure I wanted to give. "I wasn't protecting you, Marisol. I was protecting myself from loving something I couldn't control. And look where it got me. I destroyed us both." Chapter 10. Skin Hunger. Recovery looked different on Leandro than I expected. I imagined that once the fever broke, and the worst of the severing's physical symptoms receded, he would revert to the cold, a distant alpha who had ruled Valle Santo from a throne of ice. I expected him to pull back, to rebuild the walls of his dignity, and perhaps even leave now that he wasn't actively dying. I was wrong. The fever had burned away the sickness, but it had left something else behind. A raw, unshielded desperation that was infinitely more dangerous to my peace of mind. He was no longer a dying man. He was a starving one. And the only thing that satiated him was me. He didn't just want to be in the same room. He needed to be within reach. His presence a constant heavy warmth at my back. A shadow that moved when I moved and stopped when I stopped. The apartment, usually spacious enough for one person, suddenly felt incredibly small. Everywhere I turned, he was there. If I sat on the sofa to read, he sat on the floor at my feet. I'm resting his head against my knee with a contented sigh that vibrated through my bones. If I went to the bathroom, he waited in the hallway, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, his eyes tracking the door like a sentry. It wasn't predatory in a threatening way. It was a biological imperative. The books called it skin hunger, the intense physical need for tactile contact that wolves experienced after prolonged isolation. Leandro had been isolated for 3 years, even surrounded by a pack, and now he was making up for every second of lost time. He was drinking me in, filling the hollow spaces in his soul with the simple reality of my existence. Dinner became a slow, agonizing dance of proximity. I decided to make a simple pasta dish, needing something to do with my hands other than tremble under his gaze. But the kitchen was narrow, a galley style that forced us into intimate quarters. Leandro insisted on helping, though his help mostly consisted of standing directly behind me while I chopped garlic, his chest brushing against my shoulder blades with every breath. He reached around me to grab the salt, his arm boxing me in against the counter, and stayed there for a beat too long, his nose burying itself in the curve of my neck. He inhaled deeply, the sound ragged and needy, sending a shiver racing down my spine that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with a desire I had tried to kill 3 years ago. "You're hovering," I said, my voice sounding breathless even to my own ears. I tried to focus on the knife in my hand, on the rhythmic chop of the basil, but my senses were overwhelmed by him. He smelled of soap, my soap, and the deep earthy musk of healthy male wolf. It was a heady, intoxicating combination that made my knees weak. He didn't step back. Instead, he leaned closer, his chin resting lightly on top of my head, his hands gripping the edge of the counter on either side of my hips, effectively trapping me in a cage of his own body. "I'm learning," he murmured, the vibration of his voice humming against my skull. "I never knew you cooked like this. I never knew you hummed when you concentrated. I missed all of it, Marisol. Every small, mundane detail of you. I feel like a man who has been blind his whole life and just opened his eyes." His hands moved from the counter to my waist, his thumbs rubbing soothing circles against the fabric of my sweater. It was a tentative touch, reverent, as if he were handling a holy relic that might crumble if he squeezed too hard. "Do you have any idea what it does to me? Just standing here, just breathing the same air?" I turned in his arms, the knife clattering onto the cutting board. We were chest to chest now, so close that I could see the flecks of gold in his amber eyes, swirling like molten metal. The air between us was thick, charged with 3 years of silence and 3 days of intense forced intimacy. His gaze dropped to my lips, heavy and dark with intent. He leaned down, slow and deliberate, giving me every chance to push him away. I wanted to kiss him. God, I wanted to kiss him. My body leaned forward, drawn by the magnetic pull of the bond, aching to bridge the final inch. But then, the memory of the cold wind in the valley hit me. The memory of standing alone while he turned his back. If I kissed him now, if I let him claim me in this kitchen, I would be surrendering the only power I had left. I would just be the girl who waited. I placed my hands flat against his chest and pushed. It wasn't a hard shove, but it was enough. "No," I whispered, the word trembling. "I can't. You don't get to just walk back in and have everything. You don't get to consume me just because you're hungry." Leandro froze. For a second, I thought the rejection would shatter him, or worse, anger the wolf that was so clearly close to the surface. But he didn't growl. He didn't fight. He stepped back, putting a foot of distance between us, though his eyes never left mine. He took a deep, steadying breath, running a hand through his hair, looking at me with an intensity that burned hotter than any touch. "I will wait," he vowed, his voice low and laced with a terrifying amount of patience. "I will wait until the mountains crumble, Marisol. I will sleep on your floor and guard your door and starve until you are ready to feed me. But make no mistake, I am not going anywhere. I will not stop wanting you, not for a single second, until the day I die." Chapter 11. The Beta Arrives. The domesticity of the last 24 hours was a strange, intoxicating drug. After Leandro's vow to wait for me, the air in the apartment had shifted from desperate to heavy, laden with a thick, syrupy tension that stuck to my skin. He wasn't just waiting, he was integrating. I sat at the small kitchen table, attempting to balance the bakery's ledger. But my focus kept drifting to the living room, where the most lethal predator in the hemisphere was currently folding my laundry. It was a surreal, almost comical tableau that made my chest ache with a confusing mixture of affection and lust. Leandro, whose hands had broken bones and severed treaties, was holding up one of my lace camisoles with the same gravity he used to inspect a battle map. He smoothed the fabric, his massive, scarred fingers handling the delicate silk with a reverence that made my breath hitch. He wasn't just doing chores. He was performing an act of service, proving that no task was beneath him if it meant being near me. I watched him pick up a pair of my socks, rolling them into a perfect military-tight ball. He caught me staring, his amber eyes locking onto mine over the pile of towels. A slow, knowing smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. A flash of the arrogant wolf I remembered, softened by the domestic warmth of the room. "You're staring, Marisol," he rumbled, the sound carrying easily across the open space. "If you want me to stop, just say the word. But I find the scent of your detergent soothing. Lavender and you. It quiets the noise in my head." He didn't look away, and the implication hung there. He was surrounding himself with my scent in the most intimate way possible, claiming my mundane existence as his new territory. The moment shattered a second later. The front door didn't just knock. It exploded inward with a deafening crack of splintering wood. The lock gave way under a force that could only be supernatural. In the heavy steel-core door, slamming against the drywall with enough violence to shake the floorboards. I screamed, scrambling back from the table, but Leandro was already moving. In a blur of motion that defied physics, he was over the back of the sofa and standing in front of me, a wall of tense, vibrating muscle. He didn't shift, but the air around him warped with the sheer pressure of his aura. A low, thunderous growl tore from his chest, shaking the windows in their frames, a warning to whatever threat had dared to breach our sanctuary. "Stand down!" a voice bellowed from the hallway, breathless and panicked. A figure stumbled into the room, chest heaving, eyes wild and darting around as if expecting an ambush. It was Declan, the beta of Valle Santo. He looked like he had run the entire 300 miles from the territory. His clothes were torn, his boots caked in gray mud, and his face was drawn with the same exhaustion that had plagued Leandro, though without the feverish edge of the severing. He held a defensive stance, his claws extended, clearly expecting to find his alpha in a cage or a coma. Instead, he froze, his eyes widening comically as they landed on Leandro, who was standing barefoot in my living room, shielding me with his body, while a perfectly folded stack of pastel towels sat on the coffee table behind him. "Alpha!" Declan choked out, his aggression evaporating into sheer confusion. He lowered his hands, looking from Leandro's uninjured form to me, peeking out from behind his back. "You're folding laundry?" "I tracked your signature through the storm. I thought she had you bound. God, in looking at the energy coming off this building, I thought you were burning the city down." The beta slumped against the doorframe, the adrenaline crash visible in the way his shoulders dropped. "You're alive. The bond? It feels stable. The screaming in the pack link stopped 2 days ago. I am alive because she allowed me to be," Leandro said, his voice cold and sharp, devoid of the warmth he had shown me moments earlier. He didn't step aside. He remained a barrier between his second-in-command and me. "Why are you here, Declan?" I gave orders. No one was to follow me. I came here to die or to heal, alone. You disobeying me suggests the pack has forgotten who leads it. Declan flinched, but he didn't back down. He looked past Leandro, meeting my eyes for the first time. The desperation in his gaze was terrifying. And it wasn't just worry for a friend. It was the look of a man watching his world end. "I didn't come for you, Alpha," Declan said, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and awe. "I came because we have no choice. The pack didn't just lose a Luna 3 years ago, Marisol. We lost our luck. Since you left, the winters haven't ended. The game has moved south. The river is drying up." He took a step forward, ignoring Leandro's warning growl. "The territory is rejecting us. It's turning gray. The elders say the land is dying of a broken heart because we exiled its mother." He dropped to one knee, not to Leandro, but to me. "We don't just want you back. We need you. If you don't return to the Valle Santo, There won't be a pack left to save by winter. Chapter 12. The Ultimatum. And the silence that followed Declan's declaration was heavy enough to crush bones. The beta remained on one knee, his head bowed in a posture of desperate reverence that made my skin crawl with a mixture of awe and revulsion. For 3 years I had convinced myself that I was the one who had lost everything. My home, my pack, my mate. But looking at the exhausted, mud-streaked warrior on my floor, I realized the truth was far stranger. I hadn't lost Valle Santo. Valle Santo had lost me. And without its heart, the body was withering. It was a terrifying responsibility to place on the shoulders of a baker who just wanted to pay her rent and forget the color of a wolf's eyes. The unfairness of it clawed at my throat, hot and bitter. They had cast me out like trash, and now that their crops were failing and their rivers were running dry, they wanted me to return as a savior. It was the ultimate insult, wrapped in the guise of destiny. "Get up, Declan," I said, my voice sounding flat and distant in my own ears. I turned away from them both, unable to look at the hope in the beta's eyes or the dark, brooding intensity in Leandro's. The apartment felt suddenly too small, a cage of drywall and expectation. I needed air. I needed rain that didn't smell like wet dog and ancient guilt. I grabbed my coat from the hook by the door, ignoring the way both men tensed, their instincts screaming at the sudden movement. I can't listen to this right now. I need to think. Don't follow me." I walked out before they could argue, slamming the door on the heavy atmosphere of the apartment. I took the stairs 2 at a time, my boots hitting the pavement outside with a punishing rhythm. The city rain was cold and sharp, biting at my cheeks, washing away the scent of cedar and desperation that clung to my clothes. I walked without a destination, weaving through the late-night crowds, trying to outpace the pounding of my own heart. The anger was a living thing inside me, a fire that burned against the damp chill of the night. Why should I save them? Why should I heal the land that had rejected me? I had built a life here. I had friends. I had the gilded crumb. I was happy, or at least I had been content in my safety. Going back meant walking into a den of wolves who remembered me as the weak girl who cried too much. But even as I raged, I felt him. He hadn't listened, of course. He was following me. I didn't need to turn around to know that Leandro was there, and I could feel his presence like a phantom limb, a heavy warm pressure at the base of my skull. He wasn't stalking me like prey. He was shadowing me like a guardian spirit. He kept a respectful distance, half a block back, moving through the shadows with a silence that terrified the city pigeons but made my wolf hum with a treacherous sense of security. I stopped on a bridge overlooking the canal, the dark water churning below, mirroring the turmoil in my gut. I gripped the cold iron railing, my knuckles turning white, and waited. "You're loud when you think." His voice came from behind me, low and rumbled, blending perfectly with the sound of the traffic and the rain. He didn't come closer than a few feet, respecting the barrier I had erected, but his heat radiated across the distance, wrapping around me like a blanket. I turned to face him. He was standing under the halo of a street lamp, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his jacket, looking at me with an expression of such profound, devastating patience that my anger faltered. He wasn't asking me to go back. He wasn't begging. He was just waiting to see if I would let him live. "They want a Luna," I said, the words tearing out of me. "They want a magic fix. They think if I come back, the flowers will bloom and the deer will return and everything will be forgiven. But I am not a bandage, Leandro. I am not something you apply to a wound and then discard when it heals." He took a step forward then, unable to help himself, drawn by the pain in my voice. "You are not a bandage, Marisol. You are the blood in the veins. You are the breath in the lungs. Declan is right. The valley is dying. But I don't care about the valley. Let it turn to dust. Let the pack scatter to the winds. I only care about you. If you want to stay here, If you want to bake bread and live in this gray box of a city forever, I will stay. I will let the title of alpha rot before I force you back to a place that hurt you. The sincerity in his eyes, the absolute willingness to burn his legacy to the ground just to stand in my shadow, broke something open inside me. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was understanding. He had learned the hard way that power meant nothing without the person you were meant to share it with. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not the tyrant who had banished me, but the man who was offering me his sword. If I go back, I said, my voice steadying, finding a steel I didn't know I possessed until that very moment. And I stepped closer, closing the distance until I was looking up into his rain-slicked face. If I go back to Valle Santo, I do not go back as your mate who stays in the kitchen. I do not go back as a healer who stays in the clinic. I go back as your equal, as the Alpha's partner in every sense of the word. And if anyone looks at me sideways, if anyone questions my right to stand on that soil, Leandro's eyes flared, the gold consuming the brown, a ferocious, possessive growl vibrating in his chest as he leaned down, his forehead resting against mine. If they question you, he vowed, his voice a dark promise that sent a shiver straight to my core, I will burn them down. Chapter 13. The Journey Home. Packing up my life felt less like a departure and more like an amputation. I stood in the center of my living room, surrounded by cardboard boxes that contained 3 years of defiance and survival. The gilded crumb was closed indefinitely, a sign taped to the window that felt like a surrender flag, though Leandro insisted it was merely a pause. He moved around the apartment with a quiet, efficient grace, sealing boxes and carrying them down to the truck waiting at the curb. He treated my belongings, my heavy stand mixer, my collection of dog-eared romance novels, the potted fern I had managed not to kill, with a reverence that made my throat tight. He wasn't just moving furniture. He was excavating the artifacts of the woman I had become without him, handling them gently, as if acknowledging that this version of me was just as valuable as the one he had lost. When the last box was loaded, I took one final look at the empty apartment. It looked small and gray without my things, just a shell of drywall and cheap flooring. I realized then that the safety I had clung to wasn't in the walls. It was in the distance I had put between myself and the pain. Now that distance was evaporating. Leandro appeared in the doorway, filling the frame, his presence so large and grounding that the anxiety fluttering in my chest settled. He didn't rush me. He simply extended a hand, his palm open and calloused, a silent invitation to step off the ledge of my independence and fall back into the gravity of the pack. I took it. The jolt of the bond was immediate, a hum of rightness that traveled up my arm and settled deep in my marrow. The drive to Valle Santo was long, winding through the highways that bled into the foothills of the mountain range. We took his truck, a dark beast of a vehicle that smelled of leather and the cedar scent that was uniquely him. The cab was an intimate, enclosed world where the rest of the universe ceased to exist. Outside, the city gave way to suburbs, and suburbs gave way to the dense, imposing tree line of the wilderness. I watched the landscape shift from concrete to green, my nerves vibrating with every mile marker we passed. I was returning to the scene of my greatest humiliation, not as a beggar, but as a queen. Yet the fear of rejection, of the pack's judgment, of failing them again, was a cold knot in my stomach. Leandro seemed to sense my spiraling thoughts without looking away from the road. He reached across the center console, his hand finding my thigh. He didn't grip me possessively. He just rested his palm there, a heavy, warm weight that grounded me to the seat, to the moment, to him. His thumb began to rub slow, soothing circles against the denim of my jeans, a rhythmic motion that was maddeningly distracting. The heat of his skin seeped through the fabric, branding me. It was a claim, silent and absolute, I am here. You are safe. We are doing this together. I looked at his profile, the sharp jawline, the intense focus of his amber eyes, and felt a surge of affection so strong it nearly knocked the wind out of me. He was driving into a political storm to defend me, and he looked perfectly at peace. "We are crossing the boundary line now," he murmured, his voice low and rough, vibrating through the cab. I looked out the window, expecting to see the lush, vibrant forest I remembered from my childhood. Instead, I gasped. The woods were gray, and the trees were stripped of their leaves, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. A thick, oppressive mist clung to the ground, choking the undergrowth. It looked like a graveyard. Declan hadn't been exaggerating. The land was sick. It was a physical manifestation of grief, a landscape mourning its mother. But as the truck rolled past the ancient stone marker that designated the packlands, something impossible happened. The mist didn't just dissipate, it recoiled. As we drove deeper, the gray fog seemed to burn away in the wake of our passing, rolling back like a curtain being pulled open. A shaft of sunlight, thin and watery but undeniable, pierced the heavy canopy and struck the hood of the truck. I watched, stunned, as color seemed to bleed back into the world. A patch of green moss here, a flash of blue sky there, and the forest was waking up. It felt me. The realization was terrifying and intoxicating. I wasn't just returning home. I was the cure. Leandro tightened his grip on my leg, a growl of pure primal satisfaction rumbling in his chest. He had seen it too. The land was bowing to me. We rounded the final bend, the gravel crunching beneath the tires, and the pack house came into view. It was a sprawling lodge of timber and stone, imposing and ancient, nestled against the base of the mountain. But my breath hitched as I saw the courtyard. They were all there. Dozens of wolves standing in absolute silence, watching the truck approach. They looked tired, their postures slumped, their clothes worn. They didn't look like a pack. They looked like survivors of a long, brutal winter waiting for spring. As Leandro killed the engine, the silence outside was deafening. I reached for the door handle, my hand shaking, but Leandro was already there, opening it for me. He offered me his hand again, his eyes burning with a fierce protective pride. "Ready?" he asked. "No," I whispered, gripping his fingers tight enough to bruise. "But let's do it anyway." We stepped out into the cold mountain air, and every single pair of eyes locked onto me. Chapter 14. The Kneeling King. The gravel of the driveway crunched under my boots, a sound that seemed deafening in the unnatural silence of the courtyard. The air in Valle Santo was thinner than in the city, sharper, carrying the scent of snow and ancient stone. But beneath it lay the heavy, cloying odor of decay. I stood by the open truck door, my hand still gripping the metal handle, as if it were a lifeline, to looking out at the faces of the people I had once called family. They were gaunt, their eyes hollowed out by 3 years of spiritual starvation, their clothes hanging loosely on frames that should have been powerful. This wasn't a pack of apex predators, it was a gathering of ghosts. They stared at me with a mixture of confusion and hostility, their gazes flicking between my face and the alpha, standing like a dark sentinel at my shoulder. I felt naked under their scrutiny, the old shame of my banishment rising like bile in my throat, threatening to choke me. An elder stepped forward from the crowd, his gray hair matted and his posture stooped. I recognized him, Elias, the pack historian, a man who had once given me candy when I was a child, and who had stood silent and stone-faced the night I was exiled. He looked at Leandro, ignoring me entirely, his voice cracking with the strain of a long, harsh winter. "You bring the exile back, Alpha?" he rasped, the accusation clear. "You told us she was the weakness in the bloodline. You told us the valley required iron, not glass. Why does she stand on sacred ground when she was cast out by your own decree?" A murmur rippled through the crowd, a wave of agreement that sounded like dry leaves scraping together. My heart hammered against my ribs, the instinct to flee warring with the stubborn refusal to move. I wasn't that girl anymore. I wasn't the weeping apprentice who begged for a place at the fire. I opened my mouth to speak, to defend my right to exist, but the air suddenly compressed, heavy with the weight of ozone and impending violence. Leandro moved. He didn't lunge at Elias. He didn't roar. He simply stepped in front of me, placing his massive body between the pack and me, shielding me from their judgment with the width of his shoulders. "I lied," Leandro said, his voice low but projecting to the back of the crowd with effortless authority. The murmuring died instantly. "I told you she was weak because I was too arrogant to admit that I was the one who was unworthy. I told you the valley needed iron, and look around you." He gestured to the gray, lifeless trees, the dry fountain in the center of the courtyard, the miserable faces of his kin. "Iron rusts. Iron breaks. We have been eating iron for 3 years, and we are starving." He turned his back on them. It was a tactical insanity. An alpha never turns his back on a challenged pack. But he didn't care. He turned to face me, his amber eyes burning with a terrifying, the beautiful intensity that locked me in place. The rest of the world fell away. There was only him, the heat radiating from his skin, and the desperate, raw honesty in his gaze. He took a breath, a shuddering intake of air that rattled in his chest, and then slowly, deliberately, he sank down. My breath hitched in a gasp that was loud in the quiet yard. Leandro, the alpha of Valle Santo, the man who had ruled with terror and ice, dropped to both knees in the dirt at my feet. He didn't kneel like a man defeated. He knelt like a knight, swearing fealty to his queen. He took my hand in his large, rough palms engulfing my trembling fingers, and pressed his forehead against my knuckles. The shock of it silenced the wind itself. The pack gasped, a collective intake of breath that sucked the air out of the courtyard. Alphas did not kneel. Not ever. Not for anyone. "Leandro," I whispered, looking down at the dark crown of his head, my heart breaking and reforming in a single beat. "Get up. You're the alpha." "Not without you," he answered, his voice muffled against my skin, but loud enough for every wolf to hear. He lifted his head, looking up at me with eyes that held the wreckage of his pride and the foundation of his love. "I broke the law of our ancestors to send you away. I broke the bond to keep you safe, and in doing so, I broke this pack. I am not the one who needs to earn his place here, Marisol. I am the beggar." He squeezed my hand, anchoring me to the earth, anchoring me to him. "She is not the exile. She is the mercy we do not deserve. And if you want to follow me, if you want this valley to breathe again, and you will bow to her before you ever bow to me again." Chapter 15. The Mating. The heavy oak door of the Alpha's quarters clicked shut, sealing out the murmurs of the pack and the cold mountain air, leaving us in a vacuum of sudden, deafening silence. The room was exactly as I remembered it from 3 years ago, Spartan, dominated by a massive bed carved from dark timber, smelling of beeswax and the lonely masculine scent of a man who slept alone. But the air between us was different now. It was thick, charged with the electricity of the storm we had just weathered in the courtyard. Leandro didn't move from the door. He stood with his back to the wood, his chest heaving as if he had just run a marathon, his amber eyes locked on me with a terrifying raw desperation. He looked like a man who had just gambled his entire soul on a single hand of cards and was waiting to see if he had won, or if he was about to be executed. "You knelt," I whispered, the image of his submission still burning behind my eyelids, shaking the very foundation of my understanding of him. "Leandro, you knelt in the dirt, in front of Elias, in front of the pups. You destroyed your authority." "I established it," he rasped, pushing off the door and closing the distance between us in 2 long, predatory strides. He didn't stop until he was towering over me, his heat radiating like a furnace, scorching the chill from my skin. Authority without you is just tyranny, Marisol. I told you I would burn it down. I meant it. He reached out, his hands trembling slightly as they framed my face. His thumbs brushing the hollows of my cheeks with a reverence that made my knees weak. I am done waiting. I am done starving. You are in my room. You are in my territory. Tell me to stop, and I will walk out that balcony door and throw myself off the mountain. But do not tell me to wait. I didn't tell him to stop. I couldn't have formed the words even if I wanted to. The pull in my chest, that nagging fishhook that had dragged me from the city, suddenly became a winch, reeling me in until there was no space left between us. I reached up, tangling my fingers in the hair at the nape of his neck, and pulled him down. The kiss wasn't gentle. It was a collision of 3 years of grief and hunger. A desperate, devouring thing that tasted of salt and rain and absolute surrender. He groaned, a low guttural sound that vibrated against my lips, and swept me up into his arms, his grip bruising and possessive, carrying me to the bed as if I were the only solid thing in a world dissolving into mist. We fell onto the mattress, a tangle of limbs and frantic hands, the barriers of clothing becoming intolerable obstacles. When skin finally met skin, it wasn't just physical, it was metaphysical. The moment his bare chest pressed against mine, the sickness that had been eating him alive simply evaporated. I felt the fever break under my fingertips, the unnatural heat replaced by the strong, steady rhythm of a healthy heart. The bond, which had been a frayed and bleeding thread for so long, snapped into place with the force of a thunderclap. It was a physical sensation, a golden wave of light and warmth that flooded my mind, washing away the gray corners of my own loneliness. I gasped, and arching into him, feeling his soul knit itself back together with mine, the seams vanishing until I couldn't tell where his pain ended and my healing began. Mine, he growled against the sensitive skin of my throat, his teeth grazing the pulse point that hammered a frantic rhythm. You are the air in my lungs. You are the blood in my veins. I am not whole without you. I am nothing without you. He wasn't asking for permission anymore. He was stating a fundamental law of the universe. The intimacy that followed was slow, worshipful, and overwhelming. He treated my body like a holy site he had been exiled from, mapping every inch with his hands and mouth, murmuring praises that would have made me blush if I hadn't been so lost in the sensation of being completely, utterly claimed. There was no pain, only a fierce, some blinding joy as the connection solidified, rooting me to the bed, to him, and to the very stone of the mountain beneath us. As the aftermath settled over us, a heavy golden lassitude pinning us to the sheets, I lay with my head on his chest, listening to the powerful, slow beat of his heart. He ran his hand down the length of my spine, a possessive, grounding touch that told me he would never let go again. But as I drifted on the edge of sleep, the silence of the room was suddenly filled with a low, humming murmur. It wasn't a sound I heard with my ears, it was a vibration in the center of my skull. I stiffened, my eyes flying open, as a dozen, then 100, phantom voices whispered at the edge of my consciousness. I could feel curiosity. I could feel relief. I could feel a deep, abiding hunger that wasn't my own. Leandro, I breathed. Clutching his arm, my voice trembling with the magnitude of the realization. I can hear them. I can feel everyone. The bond hadn't just connected me to him. It had plugged me into the current of Valle Santo itself. I wasn't just his mate anymore. I was the Luna, and the pack was waiting for me to speak. Chapter 16. The New Order. Sunlight didn't just enter the Alpha's bedroom. It invaded it, cutting through the heavy velvet curtains to pool on the floorboards in pools of defiant gold. I woke up with the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that felt more like restoration than fatigue. my body humming with a strange, vibrant energy that wasn't entirely my own. Leandro was dead to the world beside me, his massive arm thrown across my waist like a steel band, pinning me to the mattress, even in his sleep. For the first time in 3 years, perhaps for the first time in his life, his face was completely slack. The deep furrows of worry between his brows smoothed out by the peace of a bond finally settled. I watched him for a long moment, tracing the line of his jaw with my eyes, marveling at how the monster who had terrified the coast looked so much like a boy who had finally found his way home. I carefully extricated myself from his grip, replacing my body with a heavy pillow, which he immediately pulled against his chest with a possessive grunt. I grabbed one of his discarded dress shirts from the floor, the fabric swallowing me whole and smelling of cedar and the musky aftermath of our night together, and padded barefoot out of the room. The hallway was silent, but it wasn't empty. I could feel the pack sleeping around me, and 100 heartbeat signatures pulsing at the back of my mind like a living map. They were anxious, hungry, and waiting, even in their dreams. My healer's instinct, the very thing Leandro had once called a weakness, flared to life with a demand that couldn't be ignored. They didn't need a speech. They didn't need a display of dominance. They needed breakfast. The pack kitchen was a cavernous industrial space that looked like it hadn't seen a genuine meal in a decade. The stainless steel counters were cold and dusty, the pantry stocked with nothing but protein bars and canned goods. Fuel for soldiers, not food for a family. I pushed up my sleeves and went to work, locating a forgotten sack of flour and a jar of honey that had crystallized in the back of a cupboard. The rhythm of baking took over, not a familiar dance of kneading and waiting that settled my nerves. I moved with efficiency, banging pots and firing up the massive gas ovens until the air, previously stale and cold, began to thicken with the rich, intoxicating scent of yeast and caramelizing sugar. It was a smell that belonged in the gilded crumb, not a war room, but as the warmth spread, the house began to wake up. I didn't hear them enter so much as I felt the shift in air pressure. One by one, then in small groups, the wolves of Valle Santo drifted into the kitchen. They stood near the walls, hesitant, their eyes wide and dark with confusion. They looked at the flour dusting the counter, at the steam rising from the ovens, and finally at me, standing in their alpha shirt with my hair in a messy knot. Elias, the elder who had challenged me in the courtyard, stood at the front. He looked older this morning, his shoulders slumped under the weight of his own bitterness. I pulled the first tray of sweet rolls from the oven, the golden brown dough glistening with honey glaze, and placed it on the island between us. I didn't say a word. I simply broke a roll in half, steam curling into the air, and held it out to him. Elias stared at the bread as if it were a trap. Then with a trembling hand, he reached out and took it. He took a bite, and the change was instantaneous. His shoulders dropped. A sigh that sounded like a sob escaped his throat. He looked at me, his eyes wet, and nodded once. A silent, absolute surrender. That was the signal. The rest of the pack surged forward, not with the aggression of starving animals, but with the polite desperation of children who had forgotten what warmth tasted like. I fed them. I tore bread. I poured coffee. I slapped hands that tried to grab seconds before the pups had eaten. I was ruling them, commanding the room with nothing but flour on my hands and a stern look, filling the hollow places in their spirits that Leandro's iron fist had never been able to touch. I thought I needed an army. A rough, sleep-heavy voice rumbled from the doorway. I looked up to see Leandro leaning against the frame, wearing only sweatpants, his arms crossed over his bare chest. He wasn't looking at the food. He was looking at me, his amber eyes shining with a mixture of awe and terrifying devotion. He watched his warriors, men and women who could kill with a single blow, eating out of my hand like tame dogs, their aggression soothed by the simple domestic magic I had brought into his house. "You didn't need an army, Leandro," I said, wiping my hands on a towel as I walked toward him, the pack parting for me like the Red Sea. You needed a home. He caught me around the waist, pulling me into him without caring who was watching, and buried his face in my neck, inhaling the scent of bread and mate. You conquered them, he whispered against my skin, his voice thick with emotion. You didn't throw a single punch, you didn't bare a single tooth, and you brought them to their knees. You are more powerful than I ever was. He pulled back to look at me, a smirk touching his lips. And to think, I almost let you go because I thought you were too soft. You're lucky I'm soft, I teased, threading my fingers through his messy hair. If I were hard, I wouldn't have let you back in my bed. Never again, he vowed, lifting me effortlessly until my feet left the floor, his grip tightening as if gravity were trying to steal me back. You run this kitchen, you run this pack, I just work here. Chapter 17. Roots and Wings. Summer in Valle Santo was nothing like the gray weeping season I had returned to 6 months ago. The valley had exploded into a riot of color, the ancient redwoods shaking off their lethargy to shelter a carpet of wildflowers that seemed to mock the memory of the blight. The river, once a trickling vein of mud, now roared with snowmelt, clear and cold and full of life. It was as if the land itself had been holding its breath for 3 years, waiting for the precise moment my boots hit the soil to finally exhale. I stood on the wraparound porch of the pack house, wiping flour from my hands onto a linen apron that had become my unofficial uniform of office. The scent of rising dough wafted through the open windows, mingling with the crisp mountain air, a perfume that had become the signature scent of the pack's resurrection. We weren't just surviving anymore, we were thriving, fat on joy and sourdough, and the constant low-level anxiety that had plagued the wolves had been replaced by a boisterous, chaotic peace. I watched the sun dip below the jagged tree line, painting the sky in bruises of purple and gold, feeling a profound sense of rightness settle in my bones. The Gilded Crumb had opened a satellite location in the nearest human town, staffed by 2 teenage wolves who were learning that there was more to life than patrolling borders. But the heart of my operation remained here, not in the massive industrial kitchen where I held court. The pack had adjusted to the new rhythm with surprising ease. They had traded their grim stoicism for a softer, more communal strength, learning that a full belly and a warm hearth were better defenses against the dark than any amount of posturing. I took a deep breath, savoring the quiet moment, before 2 massive, warm arms wrapped around my waist from behind, pulling me back against a chest that felt like a fortress wall. Leandro rested his chin on the top of my head, his body humming with a low, contented vibration that I felt in my teeth. He was unrecognizable from the dying skeletal creature who had collapsed on my doorstep in the rain. He was vibrant, his skin bronzed from working in the sun, and his muscles thick and corded with functional strength rather than the desperate tension of survival. He smelled of fresh-cut cedar and the river, a clean, wild scent that made my wolf preen with possessive delight. He didn't say a word, just held me there as the twilight deepened, grounding himself in my presence as he did a dozen times a day. He was still the alpha, lethal when necessary, commanding when required. But with me, he was just a man who had narrowly escaped his own foolishness and spent every waking moment grateful for the second chance. "You're thinking too loud again," he murmured, his voice a rough velvet rumble against my ear. "I can hear the gears turning. You're wondering if the supply truck is going to make it up the pass tomorrow, aren't you?" He pressed a kiss to my temple, his hands splaying over my stomach, his thumbs rubbing lazy circles against the fabric of my dress. "Let Declan worry about the trucks. You have done enough today. You fed an army, broke up a fight between the twins, and somehow managed to keep Elias from complaining about the humidity. You are allowed to rest, Marisol." I leaned back into him, letting his strength take my weight, closing my eyes as he began to gently pull the pins from my hair. It was a ritual we had fallen into, a grooming instinct that his wolf demanded. He freed the heavy mass of curls, running his fingers through the strands, massaging my scalp with a touch so tender it made my throat tight. "I'm not worried about the trucks," I whispered, turning in his arms until I was facing him, looking up into those amber eyes that were now clear and bright as polished gold. "I was thinking about the apartment, about the rain, about how close we came to missing this." Leandro's expression sobered, the playful light in his eyes dimming into something fierce and solemn. He brought his hand up to cup my cheek, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw. "We didn't miss it," he said firmly. "I told you, I would have waited until the mountains crumbled. There is no version of this life where I didn't find you again." I was lost, Marisol, wandering in the dark for 3 years. But the moment you opened that door, the moment you looked at me without hate, I knew I was home. "I'm glad you came," I confessed, my voice barely audible over the sound of the river rushing in the distance. "I'm glad you were brave enough to beg." Leandro smiled then, a slow, devastating expression that crinkled the corners of his eyes and made my heart stutter in my chest. He leaned down, pressing his forehead against mine, sealing the space between us with the promise of 1,000 tomorrows. "I wasn't brave," he whispered, his lips brushing mine as the first stars began to prick the darkening sky above Valle Santo. "I was just desperate enough to know that breathing without you wasn't living. I would have knocked forever, Marisol. I would have knocked until my knuckles turned to dust. And just like that, the healer saved the king, not with a sword, but with bread and forgiveness. If Marisol and Leandro's journey warmed your heart, please hit that like button and subscribe to Storm's Werewolf Romance Library. Your support is the heartbeat of this channel, and it helps us bring more lost alphas home. I'm dying to know, what was the moment that hooked you? Was it Leandro on his knees in the rain? Or the moment the pack finally accepted her? Let me know in the comments. And don't forget to tell me where you're listening from tonight. Whether it's a quiet evening in Lagos, a busy afternoon in London, or anywhere in between, I love seeing how far our pack stretches across the world. Thank you for listening. Until the next full moon, stay wild.